Hi, this is Susie and you're listening to the Luke Experiment podcast. This is episode 6 out of 7, and if you've missed any of the episodes that have come before, wherever you're listening to this right now, you should be able to find the other ones to catch up if you'd like to do that. In this whole series, I've been exploring different students' reactions to the Luke Experiment, and for this particular episode, we've been chatting about our reactions to part 6. So if you haven't heard that, go check it out, and you can find that at storycambridge.uk, as with all the others. It's the story of Jesus' life as told by Luke, a first century doctor, and now read by a group of Cambridge students. And in this episode of the podcast, I was joined by Dorothy, who read the voice of Luke narrating the whole story. And she brought along her friends Izzy and Owen, and we had a great chat about the text as a historical source and got thinking about the reasons we might have for believing in its truth. I hope you enjoy listening, so let's jump straight in. Hey guys, thanks so much for joining. It's really fun to see you on my screen. Why don't you introduce yourselves for anyone who's listening? Dorothy, why don't you kick us off?
So my name's Dorothy. I'm at Trinity Hall in second year studying law, and I was also reading the part of Luke in the podcast, the narrator in the background.
It's fun. Are you all at Trinity Hall? Is that how you know?
Yeah, we are all at Trinity Hall. That may be a slight.
I was going to say, if we all go through our colleges, it might get a bit repetitive.
Yeah. And second year as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we got that out of the way. All Trinity Hall at second year. Izzy, what do you study?
Hi. So I'm Izzy, and I do history. So this is quite interesting from even just a historical standpoint. So I wouldn't say that I'm religious really. But I was brought up in a kind of England church. My parents are both quite religious. But because I can't remember the last time I went to church or kind of read the Bible, other than kind of at a funeral, which you don't tend to hear from Luke in a funeral, which is what it is. So I wasn't that familiar with this. But yeah, no, it was definitely interesting to listen to.
Yeah, I'm Owen. I study HSBS and I'm also at Tit Hall in the second year. I definitely wouldn't describe myself as religious. I've been educated at Catholic schools my entire life. Irish background, kind of that typical cultural element of kind of being Catholic and kind of being associated with being Irish. But I think when I was a teenager, I started to not believe in God and really didn't describe myself as religious, and I still believe everything that I kind of decided then. And so but I do enjoy talking about religion. I used to really enjoy it, and then I kind of less so talk about it now because it just doesn't really come up in daily life.
Yeah. So, Dorothy, did you also have that kind of upbringing where you were surrounded by Christianity, either from school or from family?
Yeah. So I my family, so my parents are Christians. So I grew up going to church and to the kids groups there, and I've always seen the church that I've grown up in as my family. So yeah, I've always had that. And then I did go to a school that had a slight Church of England background, but I don't really think it was particularly religious. It was very nominally religious. So I feel like as I grew up, I had almost a difference between my nominal Christian normal Christian school, and then my church, which had my family and my parents and other people that I knew in.
Oh yeah, it'll be really interesting as we chat about what we've found in Luke, having you guys and me as well having that background of some level of religious or faith influence, and then maybe taking quite different paths. That'll be really interesting to see how we react to it now. So Dorothy, you as you said, the narrator of Luke, so anyone who's listened to the Luke Experiment will have heard a fair bit of your voice. Very well read, I have to say. No, it's good. You have got a very easy to listen to voice, so well done for that. I guess you didn't have that much control over your own voice, but it's great.
Thank you, the same.
How did you find it as you were, presumably you had to read the whole of Luke pretty much to understand where your narration fitted in. Was there anything that you learned that was new from doing the whole sweep of it rather than just focusing on little bits?
Yeah, I think something that I hadn't really thought about as much before is Luke's writing. I mean, I think sometimes it's quite easy when you read a text to like think about I guess like the characters. So for this, I mean, like the main character you could say is Jesus, so kind of reading about what Jesus says, but then like reading the whole thing as Luke was just quite interesting as like someone who was noting it down, and like all the different places and the various like figures and like historical features, like places and like towns, stuff like that. I mean, it was hard to say some of them, so I feel like that was particularly poignant in my mind. But yeah, so that was quite interesting, definitely seeing that historical, I guess, side of it, which I don't think I always would focus on.
Yeah, and Izzy, you mentioned that you are a history student and that you found it quite interesting as a historian. Dorothy was just mentioning their historical details. When you were reading or listening to this particular chapter or part of the Luke experiment, were you thinking about it as a historian? Did you have any thoughts about this as a historical account?
I think to an extent, yeah, because I think, like Dorothy said, a lot of the time, the majority of people reading the Bible are reading it from a stance of faith rather than of like analytical assessment, I suppose. And kind of how I spend most of my degree is, if you're looking at a primary source, you'd be reviewing how reliable that is or how it might be biased in some way. But I think that if you approach the Bible in that way, a lot of the time it can seem quite disrespectful, because obviously that it is a book that holds a lot of importance to so many people. But from my kind of own personal faith, I suppose, or beliefs, I think you can see in this the historical elements of this time and the life of Jesus, which I know that not everyone will believe that Jesus existed, I suppose. I think for me that's not how I feel, because I think that there is historical narratives of him as a person, but obviously in the Bible it is describing him as the Son of God, and that's where my belief kind of differs from beliefs that other people might have. So I think as a historical kind of account, it is really interesting. I can't say that I am an expert on this period at all, so I couldn't necessarily give you any kind of other background details really. But yeah, no, I definitely think, I don't know how much, I'm sure there's loads and loads of historical researchers on this kind of thing that probably have really interesting perspectives on it, but my guess is as well they will probably differ quite a lot within themselves and also within kind of the church as well.
Yeah, that's kind of what I find so interesting about Luke specifically is, like, I mean, obviously we read, like, this was like section 6 of 7, but so like Luke's a doctor, so his kind of approach to everything is actually quite evidential compared to like the other gospels and like their own accounts. So like I think Luke, like from that perspective, is quite interesting because he almost is addressing it from okay, this is going to be written down for people to read. Like, how am I going to show like that this happened, or like, that I'm being truthful? So I just find it really interesting because I think at the beginning as well, like he might say something like that. Like I did like research and like listened to people and what they said and found out people's accounts, which I just think is quite interesting.
Yeah, it definitely felt like it was, at least from my experience with kind of elements of the Bible that I was maybe brought up with a bit more, it didn't seem to be so much from this like higher place of like gospel that I've kind of felt before. It did feel more like an attempted like objective account of things that happened, which it was definitely interesting, especially because that's not I don't feel like that was something that was focused on in my upbringing. I don't really know why, but yeah,
that's so interesting,
which doesn't really make sense, because I feel like if you're going to teach someone about the life of Jesus, it makes sense to start with something like Luke.
Yeah,
but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. And and you mentioned you also do HSPS. I guess there's elements of history in that as well. So maybe for both of you and Dorothy as well, humanities, well, a load of humanities here, as you're like listening and thinking about this as a historical account, like you're saying, it's very much written to try and be a faithful account of what's happened, but that there are incredible claims in it as well. What are you looking for, or what kind of things do you pick up on? How do you distinguish between what you would say is something that you would trust and then the things that you're like, I find that harder to believe?
I think for me, when listening back, I think I found myself looking for like familiar like place names, and I think it was a really good way because obviously throughout like my how many years, like 14 years of being in Catholic school, you do regularly get the kind of chronicles of each time of year it's kind of later. So before Christmas you'd get them like talk about Advent and that kind of story, and then Easter you'd move on. So it was a very like cyclical way of kind of understanding Christianity, where in Easter you would hear about the Easter story, and then so to me, I think when I was listening to it, I actually found that a lot of the like parables and kind of lessons that are kind of like the main lessons of Christianity kind of came through, and that's kind of what I picked up on most was that when he like says about I think it was the poor man giving 2 copper coins, that instantly said to me about kind of the Christian thinking about like feeding the poor, being generous despite your kind of limitations. That's what kind of jumped out to me, and how then I started thinking about how like Christianity thinks to like liberation theology, like that kind of entrance to like politics and kind of like that element of it. And then I think with how I kind of thought about like when Dorothy was describing like Jesus and all like the kind of opposition to him, it kind of like reminded me of like this like typical like charismatic like political leader, and how you often see in even like political leaders who are quite popular now, they have such strong opposition from like the establishment. I think you could probably even draw parallels with kind of the establishment of that time, and how King Herod, even when Jesus was a baby, wanted to kill any threat to his authority. I think that kind of charismatic leader really kind of fits into how I conceive how Jesus was responding at the time. I don't necessarily believe that he exhibited all the characteristics that perhaps he's believed to do, but I think even just that level of going against kind of convention at the time is definitely something to kind of look into anyway.
What did you guys, I was actually like, that reminds me, like, what did you guys think about the whole, like, I don't know, like, would you guys normally associate Jesus as like a minority? I don't know if that makes sense, but like, because I think like one thing that's really interesting about like reading this is that like, you know, like Owen, what you were saying about like the stories that you recognize, it's kind of interesting like when you like piece it all together in like a longer account, like what it actually looks like. Like I feel like it looks slightly different, and it's just like interesting at all those points you get people popping up being like, and then they tried to kill him or whatever. I just don't know. I was just wondering what you guys thought about that, because Owen, like you talking about like him as like a leader that kind of like attracted masses, but there's also like loads in this about him being like hated and people want to kill him. So I was wondering what you think about that.
That was something actually that for me, kind of similar to what Owen just said, really struck me. Not so much about discrimination against him, although, I mean, if you look at kind of crucifixion, Herod, things like that, like all of that is obviously discrimination against him, and fear of his power, which have been quite like, I suppose they're pretty prominent parts of the story of Jesus. So those are things that I kind of remember quite a lot from the things I was taught, I suppose. But one of the things that really struck me in this was how much impetus was put on, so Jesus, like, you, my followers, will be punished and imprisoned, persecuted, betrayed by family members, parents. I think the phrase faint from terror was used, because you will be following me, because you will, because you will claim my name. But you must hold strong was basically his advice. And I don't think that everyone will agree with me in this, but I felt like there was such arrogance behind that, because why should people faint with terror for your name and hold strong in it? Because then they'll be saved was what I took away from it. That was the message.
I actually had a similar it was like, because I think as well, since my like the way I've kind of grown up with Christianity. I feel like every time I kind of talk about it, I kind of have this like sense of like, oh, I shouldn't think that, because I think especially in terms of like, I'm sure like some of Luke's account perhaps does portray Jesus as to be quite I guess you could, let's give like the benefit out of, let's say, a confident person who's like aware of like their like divine right to kind of talk his like word. But I think the thing is like the same with Izzy, is like when like he almost expects his followers to kind of condemn themselves to kind of social exclusion. To me, half I'm thinking, wow, it's a lot to expect of people. But then when you think about how it fits into the overall like theme of what they're trying to argue, this idea of you should submit yourselves, whatever, for God to enter heaven, it probably does fit into that kind of idea that despite everything that will come your way, the aim is to serve God, which I don't necessarily, I do often find like in real life, I would be hesitant to give everything for this one sole cause. I think if most people would do that, people would say it's a bit much. But I guess with the weight of what they're arguing, I guess it maybe is a bit understandable, but again, I probably wouldn't do it. But
I get what you mean. I guess like it's an interesting one, because I guess, so like Izzy, you say you kind of took from it that if you do these things, like if you suffer, then you'll be saved. But like I kind of heard it as you follow me and that's how you're saved, which will bring you persecution, because I feel like the persecution is just like an inevitable part. Like here, for example, Jesus is like questioning like the status quo. He's basically saying like you're teacher of the law, maybe you have something wrong here. And in various ways he's saying like, oh, like you don't have to do things, like you don't have to like do all this to enter heaven. You just need to like believe in me, which may be like quite a confusing thing, but like he's kind of saying that's what it is to enter heaven. And then all this other stuff that like, oh, and like you're talking about submitting, that's kind of like the next step after that. But yeah, like it's definitely an interesting one. You say arrogance, I think that's interesting.
I think it's if you, I agree with what you mean in terms of, I think life is hard now. It was probably harder then, but you will be persecuted. It might not, if you're bullied at school, it might not be described as persecution, but it's your part of your like struggle or whatever. But I think you can kind of apply that to any part of your life in any historical context. Everyone goes through difficulty. But I think particularly because any example from this time is not going to just be, oh, I was picked on at school, like someone tripped me up. It's going to be a very extreme version of that. Because it's more convincing, I suppose, if you talk about these more dramatic circumstances, and B, because the historical context just was different. But to say that you will be persecuted as a result of following me, I think is true. But then to say you shouldn't falter, you should remain true to me, what then happens when you make a mistake under pain or torture or difficulty? That means that you make a mistake and don't question your faith. Does that mean eternal damnation? God turns his back on you so quickly? I don't think that faith is a bad thing in times of trouble, but I think actually it can bring a lot of relief, which I think a lot of people have found over the past year. But to suggest that any lack of that faith or questioning of it would result in this, I think is a betrayal. If you believe in God in that sense, I think that would be a betrayal from him.
What do you think of like that? So like that idea alongside, like, 'cause at the beginning of this chunk that we're listening to, like Jesus says, like, come to me like children. So like, if we're called like that's how we kind of are to treat like coming to God, like as like a father and as like children. So like the simplicity of that. Like, what do you think about like maybe like all that you said, but in light of coming like children? I don't know, like what do you think about that like image?
Well, I don't know, do you think that there's room for questioning of faith and challenge to that? Because, well, I suppose you do, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because when I think of children, like, to come to someone as a child, children are some of the most inquisitive minds. You haven't had chance yet to be oppressed by the world, I suppose, and have all of those kind of curious inquiries squashed down. And I think to have an inquisitive mind is one of the greatest strengths you can have, especially in terms of your corest beliefs. And I think a lot of Christianity, I feel, seems to be this just blind following. And I think if there's room for inquisition and questioning and challenge and all of those things, which I think occurs more now that time is changing so quickly, and how our society changes and how that relates to the Bible, does create more room for that. But if you can't have questioning and inquisition, then what's the point anyway?
I think that's a really helpful thing to bring up, that idea of, can we doubt, can we question, or do we just have to, he's bringing up that example of, in the face of difficulty especially, or persecution, are we allowed to question the faith that we have? And I think the answer that certainly I've found is that 100% yes. We're looking at Luke today, but I've recently been looking at some of the Psalms, which are kind of the songs and prayers of God's people in the Old Testament. And they are full of doubt. They are full of people doubting and asking God, like, where are you? What are you doing? How long will you turn your face away from me? How long is it going to be until you're going to rescue me? Some quite, like, what would seem like scandalous things to say to God if we think of it in those terms, that we're not allowed to doubt him, we're not allowed to question, we have to just blindly follow. But I think the presence of those Psalms in the Bible show us that we've got 100% permission to feel those things, to feel like, why God? And I'm sure many of us, maybe even on this Zoom, have asked those questions, especially this last year, like, where is God in this right now? What's going on? So I think that's really helpful, and I'll just affirm you guys, all of you, like, in asking those questions. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about, like, what does it look like for you to have faith under persecution? And just maybe an interesting nugget to throw in there is that in the 21st century, a load of the church, a load of people who would call themselves Christians, are living in countries where it's illegal to be Christians, or where they are facing extreme persecution. North Korea, China, Iran, all of these different countries, India. There's loads that I could probably pull out, and the really interesting thing to me is that in those countries, the church is growing, almost like faster than anywhere. In the West, it feels like Christianity is declining, but worldwide, the picture is very different. And particularly in China and countries like Iran, where there's fierce persecution, where if you're openly a Christian, if you're a woman, you could be raped, you could be killed, that there's real opposition. It's really interesting to me that that's where the church is growing. I wonder if that challenges or just helps us have new thoughts about what we've been thinking about there, about persecution and questioning. I don't know, does that surprise you, that fact?
I think for me, I think one of the most psychologically beneficial things about religion is that it's a really good coping mechanism. And I think perhaps that's why in the West especially, religion is definitely on the decline. Like, if you look at every kind of statistical measure, I think bar spirituality is on the decline. And I think there's even I watched a documentary where it kind of explored this idea of why less economically developed countries are typically more religious. And I think it definitely has something to do with when you kind of live in like a high wealth society that we live in, and quite high kind of like very complex like social structures and kind of how kind of life works. I think since we all live such busy lives, religion to often many people doesn't really come into it. And I think even people in kind of, I'm sure like both of you would say that religion is kind of a mechanism to kind of take a break from that such a high intensity. And that's kind of the value that I would probably see in religion, is that you take a break from that high intensity kind of life. and you get to kind of explore something that means so much to you. But I think with what I've found is that, to me, I never really found that kind of kind of aided how like comfortable I was, or how like it never had a calming presence to be. Often it kind of just frustrated me, and I found that something that frustrated me, I think I got to a point where it kind of just decided that it wasn't going to be something that I thought about regularly. And I think maybe in countries such as China, who had this regime of state atheism and really suppressing any kind of alternate kind of thought, that really fits into the kind of their political system. Because if you have a community of followers who believe in something that is beyond a regime, beyond something that's measurable, that probably does represent a threat. And I think Christians in China are equally as persecuted as other religious minorities in the world. And I think it's such a common feature that if a religious minority exists in any chamber, where it seems like an echo chamber of one thought, where you could think about the Uyghurs in Western China, you could think about kind of Christians spread out China, North Korea Christians, the Yazidis in the Middle East. Like, any minority will feel kind of persecuted. I think that's something that in the West, hearing Christians being persecuted is a really new and kind of unexplored thing, because it's happened throughout time. Christians have, of course, been oppressed in most contexts. Muslims have been oppressed. Most religions have been oppressed. It's more in our consciousness, especially in the UK, Christians being oppressed is, most people are like, oh, I can't, but like, since it's just a norm here, like it's kind of just, and I think that's kind of how I see it, is like, it almost links to if finding comfort in something. And kind of, I don't really blame people who are being persecuted for actually being quite scared, because if you find such comfort in something, and then every force, like when you send your children to school, they're going to be almost lose their religion. I think that's quite a big scare for many people who live in those kind of regimes. I
agree with a lot of what Owen's just said, actually, but I think a big part of it is this like collectivization. I don't know if that is the right way to phrase it, but like more collectivist cultures seem to have either more impetus on religion, and then often I think that can mean that kind of more minority religious groups in those areas are often discriminated against, or like in China, if there's kind of enforced atheism, although atheism isn't a religion, the same kind of thing happens, that the abnormal or minority is like a threat to that established regime. But I think the kind of collectivism of religion, it can be a really positive thing. I think that I've seen the community that, Dorothy, you have with your church and with the CU here, and I think it's amazing. And I think you've described your church as your family, and I think not only is that so beneficial to the individual, but the individual can help others, which is, I think, a big thing that a lot of people have lost maybe in the UK and other Western societies, because so many people are so self-involved and have this kind of inflated self-importance, I suppose, where religion isn't a priority because it's not necessarily about them, which is partly why I think these kind of more spiritual type religious, in inverted commas, I don't know how many people would define that as religion or not, attitudes are growing, particularly in Western cultures, because a lot of that is about your own self-growth, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. I think to improve as an individual is amazing. But I think a big part of us improving as an individual comes from what you can do for other people. However, I also think that in terms of persecution, I agree with Owen. I don't blame anyone for needing faith in a time of persecution, and I think it gives a lot of people hope just for anything, just for survival. But perhaps if people had more freedom, then they would have the autonomy to kind of be independent from organised religion, or from the need to feel that they have to have that. But I know a lot of people gain a lot from religion. But I think in terms of persecution and the amount of faith you have there, it's through necessity. And I don't think just because you need something or want something to be true doesn't mean that it is.
Yeah, and that's why I find like quite interesting, because like I feel like I say interesting a lot, but like what like Owen and both of you were saying about like the whole like collectiveness of like Christianity and like I guess other religion, but also the like necessity for it, or like it as like a coping mechanism. I kind of think like I definitely agree with you there, and I think that's one of like the amazing things about like faith is the family it brings. And that's kind of like, you know, when you're talking about Izzy, when you're talking about the persecution thing and how Jesus says all this, like you're going to lose like family or brothers, he then says like you will have so much more. And like many people say that's kind of what he's talking about, like the worldwide family of believers who are your family. But then also like that's why I think it's so important to like read these historic accounts and not say like, oh, do I need this? But like, is it true? Like that is that's not like a bad question when you're facing like this. Because obviously like, surely that brings so much more hope. Like if I'm sitting here being like, oh, like I'd love a takeaway at the weekend, I can hope for that and believe it's happening even if it's not going to happen. But if I know for a fact that's going to happen, like I have a document that says it will happen, and I study that document and I say, I think that document's right, then that's like even a better hope. So I guess like that's the thing of like, that's the thing that I find so like gripping about Christianity and Jesus, that is about a person, and about a person as well as being part of the collective. It's also about the truth of one person, and that like you see him interacting with loads of people here, like that personal level I think is like another layer to faith. Yeah.
I think the thing for me is, so you spoke about like I have this document and I've studied it and I think that that's true. That's great, and I completely respect that you think that's true. But whether or not something exists and is real is an objective fact rather than a matter of opinion. So it might be a matter of faith that me or you think different things, but the objective truth neither of us actually know. But either God exists or he doesn't, regardless of our kind of faith on that. And for me, I don't believe in God because there's no scientific evidence for his existence. And I don't, from what I've learnt and how I feel, the very definition is kind of an illogical possibility. However, I think with Jesus and with the Bible, though there's not scientific evidence, not that I'm a scientist, but I am a historian, and there is a historical account. But as a historian, I also know that historical accounts are unreliable, biased, they can be manipulated. I could write an account of my life and make myself sound like, I don't know, Beyonce or whatever. I could make myself sound like the most important person in the world. And 1,000 years from now, people could read that and think that I was all this. But the objective truth is not what I have written down.
Yeah. That's what I mean by like investigating it though, because I think that that's definitely true. But that doesn't mean that like you can't investigate, because actually there are many books like written which would like talk about various reasons why various things, like you can still look into it. And I don't think it's like an end of story, this can be manipulated. Like I think there's actually lots to probably like think about, like for example like how soon it was written after Jesus like lived, and that accuracy there, and like the amount of manuscripts and the way that it's changed, and the quantity of manuscripts, like, and the quickness with which it's spread, even when there would have been eyewitnesses from the time. Like you could have just spoken to someone and they'd have been like, that's not true, and then the Bible would have been like who would listen to that? It's not true. But I don't know, that's what I find quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree in terms of like the investigation, and you can study it, and I think that's why I'm here, because like I don't believe, but I think being able to discuss it and have conversations with people that have all different perspectives on it is really interesting. I feel like I was going to say something that was relatively interesting, but I can't remember what it was. It'll either come back or it won't.
Yeah.
Something that I just thought is that in terms of like, I think what I found with especially Christianity was that even though many of the sentiments I feel like would be quite hard to disagree with, like love your neighbor, like very, like I definitely think there was quite a good moral compass in a lot of what the Bible has to say. But I think for especially me, and this won't be the same for everyone, but I do think it's feasible that God may exist. I think if I said I know for 100% certainty that God doesn't exist, then that would be foolish for me to say, because there's no way of proving, almost like a negative that can't be proved. And I think, and often I feel like the belief in God sits outside of what human knowledge can really explore. And I think for me, the amount of kind of exceptions I have to make to believe in God, I have to ignore as Izzy was saying, I think the scientific consensus on God is quite blurry sometimes. Let's take evolution. I guess in some part you could argue that disproves God, but then if you use it, then many Christians, especially of the liberal persuasion, say evolution is a metaphor for God. If you then say it's a metaphor for God, I can't argue against it being a metaphor, because metaphors you can't prove or disapprove a metaphor. And that's where I think individual belief comes into it. If someone genuinely believes that God was the person who drove evolution, then I don't know, I can't sit there and say no. I can't say that. I can't really disapprove anything of that kind of spirit of that argument. And I think for me, I just kind of take the absence of evidence as kind of a reason not to believe, because I don't know, if I'm not finding any spiritual value in it, if I'm not finding any comfort, and then I'm like, oh, I'm going to believe despite there not being any wrong. I'm actually getting nothing almost from it. And I think if you're getting something from it, and you actually are acting in your daily life to a sole purpose, I think anyone acting in their daily life for a higher purpose is actually a really good thing, because people need motivation. If I was waking up every day with no drive, then I'd probably be quite a sad human being. It's not it's just, you need something. And I think I respect people having that something. I just don't think it was, for a lot of people, it's not that.
I guess it rests again in the idea of if you're coming from the perspective of it's not true, then it becomes a choice of, does it benefit me or not? But ultimately, if something was true, then whether it benefits you or not, it's true. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think it's definitely an interesting one, because obviously there are people out there who believe after not having investigated various things, and it is just an act of faith. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But I also think on the other side, you've got scientists who believe that the very presence of science and the origins of scientific thought as we know it is based in a Christian worldview. So I mean even something even not from science but from morality. You think about love thy neighbour. Why is that even a good thing from an evolutionary standpoint? Why should we love if it's survival of the fittest? And various things like that. I think it's it's an interesting one, because there are definitely scientists in the top of their field who would claim there is a God, and would say that there would require a bigger act of faith for them not to believe than to believe. And I think ultimately in whatever we believe, there will be some faith, because we can't know everything. And so I guess it becomes a point of how much do you know, and where's the leap to, and how far is the leap? Because so for example, my own experience when I was younger, and I just nodded along, but also didn't know what was going on, and then had a period where I was no, I don't believe any of this. It was once I kind of learned, knew more and investigated for myself and had all these doubts and questions, Izzy, you were talking about earlier, and Susie, you mentioned, and then I'm now at a point where it would take more faith for me not to believe that Jesus came, died, and that's how I can have a relationship with God. That would take me, that would be harder for me to, I don't know if that makes sense. But I basically just think I think faith's we do all have faith in something.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I agree. We all have faith. It's just different. But I think what was so interesting that you just said is why is there moral value in loving thy neighbour? Why is that? I've never thought about where that came from, but why is that a good thing? Because that's just taken as a given. And obviously everyone's well, be nice to people. That's a nice thing to do, but why is that a nice thing to do? Yeah,
that's really interesting. And also our cry for that's one of the things that for me is the biggest pointer to God existing from a purely like philosophical thing. Is like we have this thing in us which is like we want justice and we want fairness and we want equality, but like why? Like if there's so many different like biological differences between humans and like our care for those people that are vulnerable, like that stems, I don't know, that's just, I just find that really interesting as a whole concept.
Because the thing that what you're saying about everyone having faith is Owen mentioned that he didn't necessarily believe it fully, didn't have the kind of sufficient evidence, I suppose, but also wasn't getting any spiritual value out of it. Whereas I have found that I do actually get a lot of spiritual value out of it and would love to believe it and fully subscribe to it. But I just don't. And any kind of attempts to make myself feel, I suppose, that I have that whole encompassing faith, which obviously will be questioned at times, but those questions were too big for me. And I always felt like it was fake, like I was falsifying it, and trying to convince myself into something that I didn't believe, which is exactly what I was doing. Which is strange because actually me and Owen have come to the same resolution, or similar resolutions anyway, based off of quite different experiences.
I think I actually found that I think what really kind of solidified why I didn't especially believe in Christianity, because I think when you decide not to believe in God, you relate most to the religion you've grown up with, was more like, I think I focused a lot when I was younger on like the scientific element, because I feel like whether God is real is such an easy debate to kind of get into. And then I think as well, like, I actually find myself, and I completely like, this is where I think I would maybe differ from most Christians, is that I actually don't, like, who may be questioning their faith, I actually don't agree with what many of the like moral kind of compass that's in the Bible. And I think a lot of the because that's kind of where it comes to, like, when you look at scripture and let's say if you read a passage that you actually, it just does not even subscribe to how you view the world. If you read something and it almost like you fundamentally disagree with what it says, then it kind of like closes the book for me. Like, I just, even if I wanted to entertain the idea of believing in God, or let's say even if I did believe in God and but then I disagreed with what God thought, I don't really know where you kind of go from there. Because if you believe it's right, but everything in you is telling you, actually, no, that's not right. Like, you're completely worldviewed. Like, I don't even know if, let's say if I became a Christian, I don't even know how that would fit into like how I view the world. Like, I just think I probably in maybe a negative sense, I'm quite certain on some views that I have. I don't even know where Christianity would even fit into them, because I feel like they would completely oppose each other.
That's so interesting. I think like that again comes back to the question of like, what's the bottom line? Like, is the bottom line how I feel and think about like this text? Like, is that kind of the bottom line of everything? Or, oh, my laptop's about to turn off. Or is the bottom line like the Bible? So I think, like, for example, for a lot of, I'm really blurry, so I'm sorry about this, but for a lot of Christians, what they'd believe is that because the Bible is from God, so it's like God breathed, and that's like a whole separate conversation, but because of that, then what it says is like almost like the guiding principles, because if he is really creator God and knows it all and knows how best everything goes, and this is actually from him, then it's also the best like help for life. Like, obviously that's not like the whole Bible. The Bible is also like in many ways a story, and also a story describing how God loved us so much. But like in terms of like the whole like morality and like when it fits into your own, I guess it comes down to what is the final the end point of your authority in life.
Yeah, because I guess like the thing is, it's kind of a catch-all, because if let's say you don't believe in the concept of heaven, then it removes a big motivating factor to believe. Let's say even like if you, a small thing that you disagree with in the Bible, I feel like for the overall goal of reaching salvation and reaching heaven, most people would say, okay, I think that's quite like a good price to pay. But like for a lot of people, I feel like believing and subscribing to Christianity, I know there's like a lot of strands of Christianity. There's like a Quaker versus like a quite strict evangelical will have quite different worldviews while ascribing to the same text. I know Quakers have their own text, but they're all the same framework works. But I guess that's like, even let's say if I was going to become a Christian, let's say if I was a Quaker, for example, and I think Quakerism is quite like, it seems like they have a nice community, it seems, and the same with kind of the CU in Cambridge. I feel like they have quite a nice community, and but it's like where, like I feel like I feel like I would just be picking and for like no reason. I feel like I just, if I don't believe in the end goal, and actually on the way, I actually don't even believe what I have to do to get to that end goal. It almost seems, it raises the question of like, I probably should just not even subscribe to any of it. I don't like.
I think what we've picked up here in this whole discussion is actually so cool. We've got those two strands, haven't we, of like what's good and what's true. And we've got all this different evidence. We've actually talked about a load of different things, haven't we? Science and whether that points us towards or away from God. We've got that whole issue of morality. We've got these historical documents. We've got all these different evidence bases that we can evaluate, and then we've got those things we can see in our own lives, whether that's seeing the different communities around us or being part of them. And I wonder if that it can feel like whatever we decide is arbitrary, whether we decide to have a faith or no faith, whether we decide between the different denominations of whatever religion. But I wonder if partly we can use that as almost as a reason to just not investigate it, and to not really dig into, let me investigate this, let me interrogate my own worldview, let me really work out what is true, and then move on from there. And without suggesting that that's not meant to undermine anything that you guys have said, but I wonder if a good place for us to land is just that encouragement to all of us to ask those questions of ourselves, of the Bible, of God, to test this out and to test what we think, to really look at that evidence, because it seems like probably for all of us there are questions that have remained unexamined to a greater or lesser extent. And as an encouragement for anyone listening as well, all of these things that we've mentioned, as I think Dorothy said, people have gone before us. Like, we're not the first to wrestle with these questions, and so there are so many resources out there. And in fact, on the storycambridge.uk website, there are some free resources for any of us who are asking those questions, and I really recommend checking those out. But let's draw this to a close. I know, Dorothy, you have to head off. It's been so fascinating hearing from each of you, and I'm really grateful to have been able to sit in on this conversation. So just thank you so much for sharing, and hope you have a great rest of your days. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Luke Experiment podcast. We've just got one more coming up in 2 days' time. To catch up on the rest of the series or to find more free videos and resources, head to storycambridge.uk.